Landscapes are tremendous drawing subjects, but they do present some particular challenges. By definition, a landscape is a broad expanse. There's usually a significant depth of plane in our scene. There's a great distance from the very closest things to the very furthest things. And capturing that sense of distance and the sense of space that we have is part of the challenge, because often in a landscape, there's not a huge amount of tall things taking up the foreground because we're wanting to capture that space. So we want to leave a large area where we can view through anything or view over, as in this case, anything in the foreground. And yet foreground objects are very helpful, very important in a landscape because they bring part of the drawing very close to us, which has the effect of pushing the furthest parts even further away. So compositionally, we want something closer much of the time. And in this case, it's these gates, these rail gates and fencing that we have in the foreground, which turned out to be the most challenging parts to draw, just to get them right, not to have them look too large. Now I'm drawing these foreground elements with a 0.3 millimeter pen, which is the largest pen I'm going to use. I'm only going to use it for these very front things, this fence and these gates. And then I'm going to switch to a 0.2 millimeter pen for most of the landscape that's immediately behind the fence. And then a 0.1 millimeter pen for those buildings. This is the town of Robin Hood Bay on the northeast English coast. A beautiful spot if you ever have the chance to visit. And then, of course, in the distance on the other side of the bay, we have the headland. So there is a long distance. We want to create the effect. How we make our marks, what marks we make, are going to be really important in trying to do that. Now, I ummed and ahed with this fence and this gate whether to make it darker or not, whether to hatch it darker to represent what's truer in the reference. But I was afraid that if I did that, it would end up becoming too dominant when I really wanted us to be looking through and past the fence to the scene. I wanted this gate to be a framing element, not to come across as the main subject that took all our attention. So I leave it for now, and I continue with my 0.3 with the rest of the fence. Now I'm drawing this freehanding pen, so there's no pencil outlines. So you'll see me often place dots, which is to help me position things according to the reference. And if in the end I decide it's not the right spot, then a dot is usually neither here nor there in the finished piece. Now, you'll find this reference photo, of course, on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go of this landscape view of Robin Hood Bay. And you can see even here, I'm doing a row of dots just to help me position the diagonal cross piece on the other side of the gate, and the same technique on the other side. This is where you want to be really careful. You put the line in the gap between two railings and not in the railing. So I'm now adding some value here, and I'm going beyond what's in the reference just to increase the contrast and to create a little more interest in this front section and to weigh the picture down with a little more ink in the lower front part. There's a spot to sit with some people looking at the view. I decided not to put that in. It would have been good to put in for scale, but I didn't feel that it was readily obvious what it was even in the photo, so let alone in my drawing, and that therefore it would just look a bit confusing and a bit of a mess. So I decided to leave it out. I put this pathway in, this foreshortened pathway. Now, as I move up with this scene, I know that the biggest challenge will be to not spread the scene upwards too high. I've got to keep it really tight because this land is moving away from us and it's increasingly foreshortened as it moves further away, and so there's a great deal of visual compression as it rises vertically. So keeping, if you like, the various horizontal layers close enough together is important. Otherwise, we won't have room for the bay, and the headland will be relatively higher to the houses than what we have in the reference. And keeping that nice tightness to the curve of the bay, I think, is important. So I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen now, working on these further elements. I did do a few of the closest shrubs and small trees or large bushes, whatever, with the 0.3, but I have switched to the 0.2 now for most of the rest of the foliage. Now, when we have a landscape such as this, and there's lots of vegetation that's of different types of vegetation, again, the challenge is to use marks that create the effect of different vegetation, of different types of branches, different types of leaves. And that also works in with the scale that we have, the distance and the relative size of this plant to another plant. And particularly with this mid-right side plant, which has these sort of tall spires of dense leaf, trying to work out a way to represent that, because it looks quite different in the photo to the rest of the vegetation, and it also provides a point of visual interest. It's a great mistake just to have a more generic foliage technique. We really want to have a technique that can adapt itself to the particulars, particularly in landscape. Because being able to separate the different types of vegetation with our marks then helps the person looking at our drawing to separate the different types of trees and the different depths of plane in our drawing, in our scene. At this point, I still haven't decided whether I'm going to darken the fence and the gates or not. But I work at these further trees now, and you can see what I'm doing. I'm positioning the top of that tree that finishes poking into the bay, in effect. I position that according to the posts at the centre of the fences, the centre of the gates. And so, having worked hard to draw those first gates as close to in proportion as I could, I now use them as a reference point for the various elements around. And particularly when there isn't a great deal of readily identifiable reference points, when it's just a series of shrubs, coming back to that same reference point keeps the whole drawing fairly tight. Again, trying to have more marks for this more wispy, different marks for this more wispy looking bush on the left. So now I'm trying to work out, there's a bit of a headland in the bay, and there are some shrubs that come up in front of it. So I'm trying to position that, and you can see that I put a mark that represents horizontally across the page where that little headland interrupts the coastline, and then I now work at the rest of it. Now I have a 0.1 millimeter pen here, so I've gone for a lighter pen, and not just is it a lighter pen, but I'm drawing these lines as lightly as I can and still get lines dark enough to be useful. Because in the photo, this is clearly much further away. The values are much lighter. Even the darker areas are still lighter than darker areas closer. And the edges are softer. There's a much more diffuse feel that the atmosphere between us looking at this and the object creates the moisture in the air and impurities in the air and such things. So again, now I'm putting these things in. Now, I deliberately did this headland before I did the village, because I was afraid that I would end up drawing the village too large and push it up too high, and then it would be too close to the shoreline, or I'd be tempted to lift the shoreline higher into the top. And I thought that if I put the shoreline in first, it would force me to be super careful and conservative, and just give me a better sense of scale. It would help me proportion the town better, or the houses that we can see in the village better. And then I realised, fortunately at the last minute, that I hadn't quite completed the foreground that's directly below the houses. So I did that, and now I do these houses, drawing them very small. If anything, I drew them a fraction too small. But that was certainly the better way to go with this. That still reads correctly, and if I'd drawn them too large, it, I think, would have visually been less helpful. But again, there's a fair bit of detail in these houses, but they are much further away than the foreground area. So we still want them to have a sense of being a long way away. So small light marks using the 0.1 millimeter pen, but I'm using it slightly heavier than I used it for the headland behind. Now I've switched pens again, and I'm just wanting to put some marks in the foreground because I feel that it's looking very bare. And even though it is bare in the drawing, there's in the photo, there's nothing really there that I can draw. I decide that I do want to put some marks there just to tell us where the end of the drawing is, firstly, and then also to create a little bit of interest without it being too distracting in the foreground. But I get distracted and I go back to the headland, and I realise there's a bit here that I've neglected. I left it because I wasn't exactly sure where to position things. I thought I'd position things better once I'd drawn more of the distance. And so having done that, I can now come back here and draw these details, because I've drawn the things they need to slip behind. So I think it's always important to draw the things in front of other things, but that doesn't necessarily mean we start at the front and work to the back. It just depends on the composition, on the depths, on the pens that we're using, on how things overlap. And so now I've got these rows of trees on the headland. Again, I want to make them a little darker than some of the other marks there, but still keep it feeling far away. By now I've decided that I've got somewhat of an effect of the closeness and the further distance. And so I decided I'm not going to do anything to the gates. I'm going to leave them bare. Now, if I was using marker to add value to this, then it would have been simple enough to add a light value there, just to give some contrast against the pathway on the other side. But I decide that I'll exaggerate some of the vegetation a little that we see through the slats, just to make them stand out more through negative space. And I add these little marks just to represent little leaves and bits of rubbish, natural rubbish on the pathway. And then it's just finishing the last few things now in areas that I haven't seen as important enough to have done before now, just checking the front corners. And then I think my landscape is done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Landscapes are great to draw, wonderful to sit on location and draw a scene such as this. But they do have their challenges, certainly in creating a sense of depth, making choices that will help the viewer to perceive what's happening, because particularly where there is a lot of natural elements, it can be harder to create that distinction and that sense of distance, and also just to keep everything tight and together. So why don't you have a go of this? It's a beautiful scene. And maybe you'll decide to add value to the gates. And so you'll find this on my channel community page, this reference photo. But look, whatever you draw, and however you draw it, whether you darken the gates and the fence or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.